Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference titled PFAS Contamination of Drinking Water in Alaska and Beyond, an update on community and policy actions. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. Our call will last 1 hour. During the last 10 minutes, we will invite participants to ask questions or make comments. We have 3 speakers today. Our first speaker, Laurie Valeriano, and our last speaker, Pam Miller, both have presentation slides that they will be referring to. I sent links to these 2 PDFs a few hours ago. The presentation can also be found towards the top of our homepage on our website at akaction.org beneath the title of today's call. Kelly McLaughlin will not be using presentation materials to tell her story. Keep in mind that this is an audio-only teleconference and not a webinar, so you will need to click through the document yourself. Our speakers will say next slide to help you follow along. Please download the PDFs now if you haven't already done so. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today. Laurie Valeriano has worked for Toxic Free Future since 1995. She serves as the organization's executive director. Toxic Free Future, formerly called Washington Toxics Coalition, advocates for the use of safer products, chemicals, and practices through advanced research, advocacy, grassroots organizing, and consumer engagement to ensure a healthier tomorrow. Laurie has worked to pass strong environmental health policies at the state level for more than 20 years. During those years, she has led successful campaigns to ban toxic flame retardants and adopt the strongest standards in the nation for toxic chemicals in toys and children's products, and most recently, to achieve passage of 2 new laws banning PFAS in food packaging and firefighting foam in Washington state. She lives in Seattle with her 3 children and loves to practice yoga, to fish, and to cook delicious meals with friends and family. Welcome, Laurie. We're so happy you were able to join us here today. You may go ahead and begin.
Thank you so much, Diana, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Today I'm going to cover the issue of PFAS, and I've been working on this issue for, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years. In the state of Washington and across the country. And I'm mostly going to focus on really what states can do to protect drinking water, wildlife, and people from PFAS chemicals. And I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide. I don't have to talk about Toxic Free Future because Diana did a great job in explaining what we do, and we've been around for more than 30 years. I'm also representing Safer States, and Safer States, we're one of the founding members of Safer States, and we're the fiscal sponsor. It's a network of environmental health coalitions across the country, including Alaska and many other states who are working to pass chemical policies and protect people from these harmful chemicals. So PFAS, what are they and where are they found? These chemicals have been called the virtually indestructible chemicals. They are highly persistent, highly mobile. They are moving into our groundwater, drinking water, and they are in a range of products. They're in textiles, rugs, and our Gore-Tex that we use to protect ourselves from the rain and snow. They're in firefighting foam and food packaging. And my focus right now is mostly on firefighting foam and food packaging. And these chemicals provide stain resistance and waterproofing capabilities. Why do we care about these chemicals? And many of you probably have heard about these chemicals because they're winding up in drinking water. And government estimates are around 33 million Americans are affected, but more recent analysis by Environmental Working Group and others, those analyses seem like it's more around 100 million Americans are impacted. And this is the state of Alaska where there's some contamination as well from PFAS. I think that really when states look for more PFAS and do more PFAS testing, there's going to be more contamination found as well as more drinking water contamination. And where are these chemicals winding up? They're in our homes, in our house dust, in drinking water, in people. They've been detected in many species, including salmon, osprey, surface water, and freshwater in lakes. Oh, I didn't tell you to go to the next slide. So I'm already on the toxicity profile, toxicity slide, which is slide 8. I apologize. I'll keep saying next. So the health effects associated with these chemicals really range. We're looking at cancer effects, we're looking at reproductive and developmental toxicity, immunotoxicity, endocrine disruption, and neurotoxicity. And much of the evidence is on some of the older PFAS chemicals that were released into the environment. But the new science and the new information about the ones that are replacing the old chemicals are showing us that these chemicals have this similar effects. And so we're really concerned about the entire class of PFAS chemicals. We're not just looking at one or two. We're really looking at these chemicals as a class, which is critically important. Next slide. The other huge concern around these chemicals, and you all probably are experiencing it in your states and in the government, is that the contamination costs are huge. And many of these costs are associated with the forms that were previously used. But again, we're going to be seeing new costs associated with the new chemicals because the chemical industry just substituted the similar PFAS chemicals for the old PFAS chemicals. Just looking at the military installations alone across the country, we're looking at around $2 billion for cleanup. And the ironic thing here is that the military, again, is not switching out the use of their firefighting foams that cause much of this contamination with firefighting foams that would not result in new contamination. So this is going to be a particularly problematic issue as we go forward, and one of the reasons we work on PFAS firefighting foams. Michigan alone, 23 million. Alaska, I just found one statistic last night where the city of Fairbanks spent $3 million to help with contaminated drinking water, but I know there's other contamination that we'll hear about in Gustavus and other places. Minnesota, Vermont, Washington, here in Washington State, we're looking at millions of dollars to help communities with contaminated drinking water in Spokane, Whidbey Island, and Issaquah. Next slide. And really, there's experts that are coming forward and making statements about PFAS as a class and calling for them to be addressed as a class because they all share problematic properties, particularly the fact that they are highly persistent, they don't break down, and they are highly mobile. They can move into our groundwater. So the American Public Health Association, for example, is really saying that the newer chemicals that replace the old ones are regrettable substitutes, and states should really be prioritizing the reductions of all PFAS to catalyze movement to safer alternatives. The Madrid statement, next slide, it was a statement signed by over 200 scientists calling for the limiting the production of PFAS. So there's really strong momentum from scientists across the globe calling for an end to the use of these chemicals. Next slide. The federal government, we know, is always limited in its ability to address chemicals, particularly when it comes to prevention. So what we're seeing from the federal government is limited and not adequate to protect public health and the environment. The EPA dealt with some of the old chemicals requiring manufacturers to reduce emissions, but again, those manufacturers have moved to different forms of PFAS chemicals, putting out new chemicals into the environment. North Carolina is a great example where Gen X is being released into the environment there. That's a new form of PFAS. There's no federally enforceable drinking water standards, cleanup standards, reporting requirements for these chemicals to be used. The Toxic Substances Control Act does not address these chemicals as a class. And when the manufacturers voluntarily eliminated some of the old ones, TSCA allowed new ones, right? To move through rapidly to replace the old ones. In 2015, there was a rule that could have required companies to notify EPA if they were using PFOA, and they were importing articles, and they had articles with these chemicals, but that was never finalized. That could have been, some important piece that was done, but it was never done. EPA did address a limited number of products, including PFOA in carpet, but again, there's many other PFAS that can be used, and those are not being dealt with by the federal government. The Food and Drug Administration, again, dealt with some PFAS in food contact materials, some of the older ones. However, 31 are allowed to be used in food packaging. The Federal Aviation Administration requires certain airports to be using foams, firefighting foams with PFAS chemicals. These are being discharged directly into our environment where they can move into the groundwater. We made some progress in Congress where that will begin to be changed, but again, it's not good enough. The military is still using PFAS foams where they were cleaning up old PFAS foams. So that's a huge problem, but they are moving forward with looking at changing some of their requirements in order to use the PFAS-free foams that we know are effective and should be used. Next slide. So I'm really going to move into what states are doing and what Washington did to address some of these problems. And this was a New York Times op-ed that was done by Sharon Lerner, who's a reporter for The Intercept, who's been covering these issues for, I believe, about 3 years. And basically states, it's critical that states start to step in and fill some of the gaps that the federal government is leaving. And Washington did just that in 2018. And the reason that Washington, the next slide, the reason that Washington did this is that our state is really focused on how to prevent these chemicals from entering the environment and entering our homes, particularly the ones that are highly persistent, highly mobile, and some of the forms of these chemicals are also bioaccumulative, which means that they're building up in the food chain. And our state has a program that addresses this by looking at the uses and putting in restrictions and other things to prevent PFAS pollution. And so last year, for the past several years, I've been working on a plan to identify sources and reduce them. And as part of that plan, the state was able to be the first in the nation to restrict PFAS in firefighting foam and food packaging. So PFAS in firefighting foams. As part of the planning process, and as you probably all know, the firefighting foams that are used to put out oil fires and fuel fires has PFAS in it. Some do, some don't. But these Class B foams, next slide, were really developed for the military in cases where there was an aircraft carrier where there was an explosion of a bomb that set off a fuel tank and over 100 people died at sea. And the military developed this this foam with 3M, the company, to address these specific situations. And AFFF, or PFAS foam, was born. Next slide. The challenge is that while it was developed for a very specific application, these foams became widely adopted. So you'll see their use in municipal fire departments, airports, ferries, the Department of Transportation, in tunnels, the Coast Guard, many different applications where there's fuel. These foams have either been used or sold by the chemical industry to these folks who would use these foams. This picture is a picture of our Columbia River here in Washington, on the border of Washington and Oregon, where PFAS foams were used in a fire training exercise. The foam was released directly into the river as part of this training exercise. And this is not an unusual example. The use of these foams in training for firefighters has become a significant source of contamination, not only in military bases, but in fire training facilities and other places where it's used for fire training. Next slide. This is a slide from our Department of Health that shows you, how the PFAS foam moves through the environment. It doesn't stay in the soil when it's applied. It moves directly into the groundwater. And in the cases in our state, we've seen the plumes are quite large and they move quite rapidly. So they're very difficult to clean up, even when you can clean them up. Next slide. Firefighters, this is a huge concern for firefighters, the International Association of Firefighters, as well as our state firefighters union. They're very well aware of this issue. They're exposed during training and use, testing of equipment, and their actual gear. PFAS is used in their turnout gear for waterproofing. Next slide. Why are firefighters concerned? They have cancer is the leading cause of death among firefighters. And if you look at this slide, testicular cancer, they're looking at 102% greater risk just for testicular cancer alone. What are some of the, next slide, what are some of the PFAS health concerns? Testicular cancer is one of them. This is a huge concern among the firefighters, and they are working to transition to PFAS-free foams, and we worked very closely with them in our state to pass our legislation. Next slide. Pam Miller has done an excellent report with a number of experts on the alternatives to AFFF, where PFAS is used. We know that airports around the world are using PFAS-free foam. We know industries, the oil industry, others, chemical industry, are using PFAS-free foams to deal with fire. We're not ever going to say that fire safety should be compromised in any way. We know there are effective foams out there, and this report documents many of those technical issues that the chemical industry will raise, saying that they're not effective. It's just not the facts. Next slide. So our new law in Washington, we worked very closely with the Washington State Council of Firefighters and the Washington State Fire Chiefs. Next slide. What does our law do? The first issue it addressed was stopping the use of all PFAS foams for training starting July 1st, 2018. So that was a significant issue that has no exemptions in it. So airports can't use it for training. We believe the military is covered by this training ban. Any other places they're using it for training, it cannot be used. And just to note, there are specific foams for training that the chemical industry sells with the PFAS foams, and the chemical industry and the foam industry does say no PFAS foams should be used in training where it's entering the environment. So even the chemical industry agrees with that. The second thing it does is prohibits the sale of PFAS foams by 2020 unless the foam is required by federal law. And right now, the only place that's required is for airports of a certain size. That's changing. There's other exemptions in this bill for oil refineries, oil terminals, and chemical plants, which I would not suggest be exempted in other state laws because of Pam's great work and other great work that has been done to identify alternatives. It's a rapidly developing market, and we know that these are not foams that should be used in some of these places. It also requires manufacturers, if they're selling it after the ban date, to take back their foam and reimburse the retailers or the folks who purchase the foams once the ban is in effect. And finally, this is something that the fire service really wanted. It requires manufacturers of firefighting turnout gear to notify the purchasers if the turnout gear contains PFAS chemicals. We are starting to see manufacturers report there are PFAS chemicals in the turnout gear. Next slide. Again, our key partner was the Washington State Council of Firefighters. This was Michael White. He's a firefighter. He was a legislative liaison for the association, and he really provided on-the-ground expertise on why these foams are not needed on the ground for firefighters. Next slide. The other supporters that we received was really from local governments, strong support from local governments, ARC of Washington, the Association of Sewer and Water Districts. all of these entities really want to keep PFAS out of the environment and prevent PFAS contamination. Next slide. I'm going to move to food packaging. Again, PFAS, we have found PFAS in food packaging, from fast food wrappers to popcorn bags to takeout containers, like the compostable takeout containers that you all probably are very well aware of in your communities. Next slide. Why are we concerned about PFAS in food packaging? We're concerned the chemicals move from the food packaging to the food. We particularly find this when food is heated. We are concerned it moves into people. And then we're concerned about the side where it's disposed of, because some of this packaging is compostable. It either goes to composting facilities or it goes to landfills. Both places it's moving to the environment. It moves into the environment from landfills to our fish, to our waterways, and then when it's composted, it can move to crops. And there's evidence of PFAS being taken up by crops as well. So just from a big perspective, with chemicals that are highly persistent, highly mobile, we don't want any of them in food packaging. It makes no sense. Next slide. And we just did a report with Safer Chemicals Healthy Families that we just released, and looked at the fluorine content in certain food packaging. And this builds on a big body of work from other organizations. But really what you see here is that these takeout containers are the ones that are compostable, are ones that really have PFAS in them. And we're working to move manufacturers out of these products. Next slide. And some of the companies are. Whole Foods, in response to the report, announced that they were moving out of some of these products. Trader Joe's announced they were addressing it. And then composters on the back end are starting to put in place standards that say we don't want these products that contain PFAS because it's going to cause us a problem in our compost. So standards are being put in place for compost, which is good. And then states like New York and the city of San Francisco are moving forward with government procurement, and those procurement requirements are saying no PFAS in our food in our food packaging. Next slide. These are some of the alternatives that companies are looking at and moving to. This was developed by Clean Production Action, who we partner with on many alternatives, on safer alternatives work. There's a range of products from clay-coated paper to different materials like bamboo. And I just thought that would be helpful to see some of the alternatives that companies are moved to. Next slide. What does our law do? Again, we were the first in the nation. The restrictions are on all PFAS. Again, firefighting foam addresses all PFAS, food packaging, all PFAS. It bans the chemicals in paper food packaging. On January 2022, the thing that is required before the ban goes into place is that safer alternatives are identified. And that process is taking place right now in Washington State, and the Washington Department of Ecology is leading that process to find a safer alternative. If the agency doesn't find a safer alternative, they go back to the drawing board looking for safer alternatives, and then once one is found, the ban goes into place. So it's really a presumptive ban. The ban is going to take effect, and safer alternatives will be found. The market is moving and has moved in some cases. But just to be clear that even if the state doesn't find it immediately, they will continue to look and put the ban in place ultimately. Next slide. And then the supporters of the bill are really very broad, from the environmental community to Latino Community Fund. And in Washington State, the Washington Hospitality Association also supported the bill, which were all the restaurants and hotels in the state of Washington. And that's all I have for you today. And this is my contact information if you need to contact me for any follow-up questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurie. As it turns out, the cell tower and landline, there's a widespread outage in Gustavus right now. So we've tried everything, but we don't think that Kelly will be able to join us. There's a possibility that I can record her story and add it to the podcast. But what I'd like to do, just to give her even more time in case something changes, is go ahead and field questions from participants for your presentation, Laurie, at this time. So I'm just going to mix up the agenda a little bit and see if we can buy ourselves some time. So for all of you who've called in today, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *2 to unmute your line and state your name and affiliation. That's always helpful. When you are finished, if you could please press *2 again to mute your line so that we don't end up with a lot of background noise. So again, we're going to take questions for Laurie at this time.
Hi, this is Patty in Anchorage. I understood that that Congress had put in place a instruction to change the rules for that required civilian airports to use AFFF foam, that mil-spec, which requires it at military airports, that's in the works. They actually just put out, they're doing a study on that, but that's supposed to result in recommendations. But my understanding is that it has been already changed for civilian airports. So from my perspective, it doesn't say that it says that they're allowed to not use it. It doesn't say that they must not use it. It says they're allowed to not use it. And so it seems to me like that's a perfect place where state citizens of a state or local people living near such an airport could take action. So I'm just putting that out there because it's another fertile ground for activists. And maybe somebody can confirm that, Laurie or somebody else can confirm that, because I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, sorry, I probably went through that too fast when I was mentioning it. The deal with that is that Congress basically said to FAA within the Reauthorization Act that they had 3 years to remove the fluorine, requirement within the military specification, because there is AFFF meeting the mil spec is required at certain size airports. The challenge is that airports can't just do it. They can't do that currently. They have to wait for FAA to change the regulations, to change the specifications that they have to meet at airports for fire safety. So right now, they're slated to take 3 years to do that. We're saying that's too long, and we're trying to work and move that timeline on faster. But the airports can't just move to that right now. They have to wait for FAA. So the first step was taken, which is telling FAA to move forward, but the work still has to be done before airports can actually use the PFAS-free foams. On the military specification, yes, you're right. The military issued an RFP to get responses back from contractors to redo the mil spec to remove the PFAS requirement. It was just granted to the consulting firm that actually did the original mil spec. So yes, that is also in the works, and that will take time. But I believe you're correct in that it is an opportunity because the movement is there, and states can put into place restrictions on the foam, including for airports when airports can eventually use the PFAS-free foams.
Thank you, Laurie. I'd like to take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll move on to Pam's presentation, and then there'll be another opportunity for questions at the very end of the call. So if there's someone else out there who would like to ask a question, go ahead.
I live on Cape Cod, and we have problems with the Fire Training Academy, which used to use PFAS fire foam, the AAAF.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you can do with the stuff that they are stored on site that they can't use, but how they should either get rid of it or store it on site, or what its fate should be, since these things seem to be hard to eliminate.
that's a huge challenge, and we're trying to work. I don't know if that's a loose word, but right now what's happening is that the older foams, these older legacy foams that you're talking about, are being incinerated by the military in hazardous waste facilities. We're concerned that that just creates new problems for other communities when you're burning the PFAS. There are other technologies that are being developed and used, and not used, but are being looked at, particularly ones that have been used for military weapons. And there's some work being done by a colleague, Jane Williams, with the Sierra Club. So I can put you in contact with her. And that technology is not a burn technology, but it's a huge concern, because once these chemicals are created, there's no good solution from a disposal perspective at all. But I can put you in contact with Jane if you want additional information on disposal.
Actually, no, Jane.
Okay. Oh, you do? Did you know she was working on this too, or?
Well, I know it's a problem she's concerned about. I didn't know she actually had a solution.
Yeah, she has. She's gotten further in the past couple of months on how you might approach this problem with a particular technology she's been looking at. And she's working with the state of Vermont because Vermont was originally going to send their foams to East Liverpool, decided not to because of all the violations, and then she's working with them on a solution. So yeah, definitely contact her. She's way more of an expert than I am. And Pam also is an expert as opposed to me.
All right, great. Thank you, Laurie. I think at this time, we'll go ahead and if anyone who already asked a question could please mute their line again, just to make sure we don't have any background noise, I'd appreciate that. And then I'd like to go ahead and invite Pam, introduce her, and then we will return to discussion afterwards. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker for today, Pam Miller. Pam is Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics and co-chair of the International POPs Elimination Network, or IPEN. Pam founded Alaska Community Action on Toxics more than 2 decades ago, and since that time has led the organization in its environmental health and justice work through community-based participatory research and policy work at the local, state, federal, and international levels. And again, Pam does have presentation slides, so please be sure to have that document in front of you. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. We're happy to have people from across the country on the call today. Really appreciate it. And Laurie, thank you for your incredible work and your excellent presentation. Really appreciate it. I just want to talk a little bit today about the international perspective on PFAS chemicals, because these are global contaminants that don't respect political boundaries. They move on wind and ocean currents, and the Arctic is a particular hemispheric sink for these chemicals that move northward on wind and ocean currents and settle in the north and bioaccumulate in our fish, wildlife, and people. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Diana mentioned that I'm co-chair of IPEN, and IPEN is a network, a global network of about 500 environmental health and justice organizations from 115 countries. And IPEN has been involved in the negotiation of what became the Stockholm Convention, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is. But this is a group of people from around the world working for a toxics-free future, working in their local communities to deal with things ranging from pesticide stockpiles to phasing out chemicals locally and globally. And in the lower photograph, you see one of our staff members, Vi Wahi, testifying before the Stockholm Convention of about 2,000 delegates from 182 nations. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but this is just a brief overview of some of the international conventions on chemicals and wastes, and I'll talk the most today about the Stockholm Convention, which you see there is a legally binding treaty. It went into force in 2004, and now there are 182 nations that are party to the convention that agree to abide by the provisions of the convention. And I will say that the U.S. has not yet ratified this treaty, so the U.S. is not a party to it. However, the world is moving ahead without the United States. Next slide, please. The Stockholm Convention, I think, is such a critical international treaty because it's based on precaution and the precautionary principle. It recognizes the vulnerability of vulnerable populations such as women and children, and it very much acknowledges, and we work to get this language in the preamble of the convention, acknowledges that Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities are particularly at risk. In the lower right-hand part of the slide, you see a beautiful soapstone statue of a woman and her child. This is an Inuit statue that was presented to the executive chairman of the convention to remind the delegates of the Stockholm Convention that this treaty is vitally important, that it's not just abstract. This is a treaty that affects the lives and the health and well-being of the peoples of the Arctic. And this statue appears on the front days of the negotiations and implementation of the treaty every time the Conference of Parties comes together. Next slide, please. These are some of the key elements of the Stockholm Convention. Again, precaution is the underlying principle rather than managing risk, because these chemicals kind of thwart management, and it's best to focus on elimination. It ensures that new chemicals can be added, and I think this is the real strength of the treaty, that it's not just a treaty that begins and ends with an initial list of 12 chemicals that are among the world's worst chemicals that need to be eliminated, but it has provisions to add new chemicals that are of concern to the global community. It also provides for identification and inventory of contaminated sites. It has an effectiveness evaluation system built into it, so there are various biomonitoring and air and water monitoring programs that help to determine whether the treaty is actually working. And I've already mentioned the precautionary principle. The provisions to add new chemicals, again, is the real strength of this treaty. This next slide shows the deliberations of the expert committee of the Stockholm Convention. 31 members from different countries around the world come together to evaluate whether a chemical or group of chemicals should be added to the convention. This is the POPs Review Committee, Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee, and again, the expert committee under the United Nations. And there are experts from all continents except Antarctica that help to deliberate and evaluate new chemicals. In the lower part of that slide is our small team of NGOs that participates in the deliberations of the POPs Review Committee, the meetings, as well as the intercessional work that goes into evaluating these chemicals. And there's a very rigorous process to determine whether chemicals meet the criteria of the Stockholm Convention. Next slide, please. So we're getting to PFAS chemicals. So there have been 28 chemicals added to the convention thus far, and PFAS chemicals are now being nominated because of the concerns that Laurie talked about, their persistence, their bioaccumulation, the fact that they are subject to long-range transport. And these chemicals have been found to meet the treaty criteria for these parameters and toxicity. So PFAS, a chemical that Laurie mentioned, was listed in 2009. And then most recently, in September of 2018, the expert committee recommended the closing of major loopholes. And this is very significant because it was listed with certain exemptions. So it's very important that we're actually moving to truly eliminate the global production and use of this chemical. PFOA was nominated in 2015 by the European Union, and at the most recent meeting of the POPs Review Committee, the expert committee in September, they said that it should be listed for global elimination, and the full Conference of the Parties that meets in April of 2019, the 182 nations, will make this final decision in April of this coming year. Another PFAS chemical, PFHXS, which is also found in firefighting foams and a number of other applications, was nominated by Norway. And I should say that Norway and some of the other Scandinavian countries are real leaders globally in eliminating PFAS chemicals. So Norway did a tremendous job in putting together a dossier on this chemical to justify the listing. And as a result, the expert committee recommended that this chemical be advanced to the final stage of evaluation at their meeting in 2018. So it has one more evaluation stage to go through, which considers socioeconomic effects. Next slide, please. Laurie already mentioned this report. This is a report that the International POPs Elimination Network did with a number of experts from the firefighting community, from fire safety experts, toxicological experts, manufacturers, and users of fluorine-free foams in airports and military facilities and oil and gas facilities throughout the world. And this was one of the key recommendations that you can read there, that the use of fluorinated foams in firefighting foams, and I should say this is a major dispersive use, which is why we're so concerned about it. As Laurie mentioned, it travels very easily. It contaminates groundwater of millions of people around this country and also around the world. And so it's simply not necessary to continue to rely on these fluorinated foams when there are safe alternatives that are non-fluorine based that are equally effective, and then also don't result in widespread contamination and human health problems. Next slide, please. So just quickly, these are some of the findings and conclusions from the expert committee that met in September of this year. And again, they recommended the substance PFOA should be listed for global elimination. PFHXS warrants global action and moves to the final stage and the closing of the loopholes for PFAS. And I think one of the most significant things was their recommendation concerning firefighting foams, again, recognizing that firefighting foams containing these harmful substances should not continue to be manufactured or used, and that their fluorinated alternatives are not recommended. So this is really taking the class approach that Laurie was speaking of in saying that, yes, we want to phase out the older uses of PFOA and PFAS that have been sort of the foundation of firefighting foams in past decades. However, we can't also then transition simply to the short-chained alternatives because they have a similar toxicological profile and very likely have similar health effects. So these are the recommendations, and it was a very strong class-based recommendation to phase out these substances, not just the older PFOA and PFAS-based foams, but also looking at the short-chain versions as well, and saying that that's not a suitable substitute. Next slide, please. These were the specific recommendations on firefighting foams, again, calling for no production, no use in training, no export or import, and then ensuring restrictions to where releases can be contained, and ensuring that these wastes are managed in accordance with the treaty. And the treaty does not recommend incineration of these wastes for the reasons that Laurie talked about. Next slide, please. The next conference of the parties will meet in Geneva in April and early May, and they will make very important global decisions on PFOA and PFAS. This is critically important because although there have been some voluntary phase-outs in the U.S. and elsewhere, production of these substances continues in places such as China and India. So that's really why it's critical to have a global agreement on these chemicals. And again, not only for that, but because they do migrate, they transport themselves across political boundaries and affect the global environment. So there's an opportunity really to work on this. The the global network of IPEN will have a very strong presence there. We're also working to engage people that have been affected by PFAS contamination, including firefighters and communities, because we are, and we serve to be the conscience of the convention to remind delegates that this is a critically important issue for public health and the environment. And I think I'll end there and welcome any questions.
Thanks, Pam. We can always count on you to provide the very latest update on what the international community is doing to address concerns about these most dangerous chemicals, and PFAS is clearly among them. So thank you so much for the update. I have been in touch with Kelly, and via satellite internet. That's the only form of communication that is working in Gustavus right now. She has agreed to tell me her story, and I will record it and add it to our podcast, so you will still get an opportunity to hear about what's happening there. She's a fourth-generation Southeast Alaskan. She grew up in Juneau, spent her summers in Gustavus, where her mom's family bought the majority of a homestead in the 60s, and she had her well tested over the summer and received the results of the well water testing and found that it contained higher levels of PFAS than what is safe by a fairly large margin. So look for the recording, which I will send out as soon as I'm able to speak with Kelly, hopefully in the next day or two. And with that, I would like to invite questions for either of our speakers today. Again, you press *2 to unmute your line. If you'd like to participate, please state your name and affiliation, and then press *2 again when you're done. Thank you. So these are questions for either of our speakers, either for Laurie, Valeriano, or for Pam Miller. Or comments.
Hi. I just learned something really interesting about the difference between the short chain and the long chain fluorinated chemicals. Because the long chain, my understanding is that the long chain forms are the ones that are what Pam was calling legacy foam uses for foams, and that the chemical industry is proposing using the short-chained ones. And as Pam said, they're likely to have the same health effects as the long-chain ones. But even more horrifying to me was the idea that for reasons which only a chemist could explain, and I'm not, the short-chain ones, once they're in the environment, oftentimes convert themselves into the long-chain ones, which are virtually indestructible. And so they're even more dangerous in some ways, and that is certainly not being acknowledged by the chemical industry. So maybe Pam can talk some more about that, because I think that's really important that when the chemical industry is pushing the short ones as the answer, the short-chained ones, that we understand why that's not really an option.
I'll say something about that, and thank you for that comment. And Laurie, I certainly welcome you to chime in as well. The PFAS chemicals are a family of chemicals. There are over 4,000 different versions of these chemicals that have quite a complex chemistry. And it is true that in the manufacturing and dispersion of these chemicals that they can transform in different forms from short chain to long chain and back to short chain. It's a very complex chemistry, but it is very true that while many of these chemicals have not been studied fully for their toxicological properties, a lot of the short-chained chemicals have a very similar toxicological profile as do the long chains, and there is this conversion problem. There are precursors and conversions, and that I think is really why it's necessary to take a class approach and eliminate this entire class of chemicals.
Thanks, Pam. Laurie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I thought that was good. Yeah.
We do have time for a couple more questions, so I encourage anyone who would like to participate, just press *2 to unmute your line. Okay. Well, I don't think anyone will mind ending a little bit early since everyone is probably incredibly busy with wrapping up things for the holidays. No pun intended there. So I would now just like to make some final remarks. Our next Che Alaska call will be on Wednesday, January 9th, and will be on a recent study on mercury in women of childbearing age in 25 countries. If you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us by calling 222-7714. That's area code 907. The following is a recording of Kelly McLaughlin discussing the discovery of PFAS in the small Southeast Alaskan community of Gustavus and how her community is addressing the problem. She was unable to join us earlier today for our live Che Alaska call due to a widespread cell tower outage, but she's kindly been able to join me this afternoon to tell her story. Kelly McLaughlin is a fourth-generation Southeast Alaskan. She grew up in Juneau and spent her summers in Gustavus, where her mom's family bought the majority of a homestead in the 1960s. She spent a few years living in Portland, Oregon, but says that ultimately fate brought her home to Southeast Alaska to raise a family and cultivate a small business in Gustavus. Welcome, Kelly. You may go ahead and begin.
Thank you. So I was trying to spend some time thinking about how I was first introduced to PFAS. It wasn't something that I ever heard of by name until the last few months. And even though it was only a few months ago, I had a hard time recalling how it all really began. But I think my first memory of it is getting a letter from the state of Alaska at the post office and almost not opening it. I asked the postmaster, is this important? She said, yes, I think it is. You should open it. So we stood and discussed the fact that there were some wells at the local airport that were contaminated and what that might mean for the community. And I remember just thinking, this is a really big deal. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I knew it was going to be a big deal. So that evening, my family kind of sat around talking about it and Googling, researching what we could find out about what PFAS was and what it did and why it was important. And we knew that the school's well had been tested and it had some PFAS in it. I don't remember if we knew the number at that time, but it registered at 44 parts per trillion. So we were reading studies about kids and how kids are affected by PFAS, and I was just blown away by how detrimental a substance was, and we were just hearing about it now, and it's in everything, and it's the substance that I've always avoided with fire retardants and Teflon pans. I've never cooked with those, or when I did, I threw them out and got cast iron because I wanted to avoid this. In researching stoves and toaster ovens, I avoided this chemical that I didn't know by name. So I sent this information that I was finding. I'm on the local preschool board, and I sent it to the other board members and said, what are we going to do about this? And I sent an email to the school principal and said, what are we going to do about this? And nothing happened. No one even responded to my emails. So I tracked down the school principal and said, we need clean water at the school. I was sending my child with clean water in a water bottle, and he said that he recommended other parents do the same, but that his hands were pretty much tied other than that. So maybe a month later, there was another round of testing. I was looking at the map while Shannon and Wilson, the contractors doing the testing, were in town, and I was thinking while I was looking at the map that the area that they had highlighted didn't make sense to me. It didn't include my house, even though my house is very close to the airport, and it did include a lot of land that was further from the airport. So I called Shannon and Wilson and told them that, and they said that I was in luck, that they had spoken to somebody local about the way water flows here and learned some new things, and they wanted to test a couple of out-of-area locations. So I offered my business and my home, and they came the next morning and tested both of them. So several weeks passed. We waited for results. I got a phone call from Shannon and Wilson about 3 weeks later. I think it was just at the end of October. and she started with the good news. She told me that my business had tested non-detect for all the 5 PFAS that they were testing for. My well at home, though, was at 130 parts per trillion, which is in exceedance, and that they would get me some bottled water right away. And I kind of laughed at her and said, that's the solution. Is there a little bit more sustainable solution? And she said that they were working on it. I remember asking her a lot of questions, but really I think I was in shock, and I don't remember much of what we talked about on that phone call. I moved back to Gustavus 10 years ago, and I just kept thinking, 10 years I've lived on contaminated properties, drinking this water, and we don't know a lot about the time frame, but we suspect, and the Alaska DEC has shared the same suspicions, that it's been used since at least the 1980s, and if not longer. And I spent summers out here in Gustavus and drinking the probably contaminated water, swimming in probably contaminated water. Raised my 2 kids here, through pregnancy drinking contaminated water. I was just spinning. I said goodbye to my dog cancer when we moved back here. I was just thinking, I was trying to put all this together and try to figure out what it means. I've grown a garden. I've cultivated a flock of chickens. We plan to have goats and horses, and we can't graze them on this property now. I was just so many emotions trying to cope with what I had just heard. So I had a little bit of time before the next meeting, and I just researched. I spent nights sitting in bed while my daughter slept next to me researching. I read everything that I could. I asked questions of everybody that I could. I asked DHSS to test my breast milk, and the first response from them was pretty encouraging. It sounded like it was something that would easily happen, but I didn't hear back for a while from them, and when I did, the phone had kind of changed. There was I didn't feel like I was being helped anymore. I felt like I was being shooed away, that maybe this was going to be a bigger problem after all. I was told that there was no labs that sampled breast milk, and when I researched and found one, they told me, good, I'm glad somebody can help. There was not a lot of support from the state on that front, and we asked for blood tests and cited all the science that we could find, recent studies, older studies, and we were told there was no legitimate reason to offer blood tests, and that our town isn't big enough for a study, and there's no way to correlate PFAS blood results with future health outcomes, so that they weren't willing to do that. So we started asking for blood banking, and we're still in the process. We do have a facility that's willing to bank the blood for us if we can be involved in a study. If we have somebody that is willing to do the study portion of it, we have a bank to keep that. So that was a win. And then at that next meeting, which I believe was sometime in November, I stood up and drove home the point that the school needed clean water. And I think I drove it a little too far, but we had results. I was a little bit embarrassed about standing up and yelling at people in the public setting, but it worked. The DOT still did not take action. They didn't provide the clean water, but the National Park Service sought permission for the school to go and fill water 8 miles away at their clean water facility. So we have jugs of clean water for the kids, at least, at the school. So that was a huge win. There's been a lot of little breadcrumbs along the way to keep me going. Another one was Fish and Game is really interested in doing a study in Southeast Alaska, in Gustavus specifically, on the moose specifically, but any game. And they've got several interested parties that they don't have the funding for it. So hopefully at some point in the next year or so, they can acquire some funding to find out how badly contaminated the moose are here and other animals that drink from the open water sources, open surface water sources that are contaminated by PFAS. So things were sort of open-ended. My family had been talking and communicating, but we weren't very organized, so we started to kind of come together a little bit more. We reached out to Pam Miller at Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and she really helped us get our feet under us and gave us some bullet points for an order in which to try to get things accomplished. And I remember talking to her on the phone, and she was just shocked that the PFAS-containing foam was still sitting in Gustavus, and it is still sitting in Gustavus today. I wrote a letter to the DOT asking them to remove it, and they cited the FAA requirement that for Part 139 airports and said that they cannot remove it. We asked DHSS again, sent formal letters to DHSS and the governor asking for them to consider blood testing, breast milk testing, or at least banking blood samples for a time when testing might be more feasible. Again, we cited all the science that we could find, trying to legitimize our request, and didn't get favorable answers. We heard no from everybody. No, we can't. No, and no answer at all from the governor's office. So we kind of got a little bit more organized. We realized that our separate efforts, weren't yielding answers and no results. So we formed our local coalition, which we're calling the Gustavus PFAS Action Coalition. And people were really excited about it. People that don't have contaminated water, people that don't even have kids in the school, I think everybody realizes this is a big deal. And we have 20 members already. We've had 2 meetings. So there's a lot of ground level momentum here, and the city has been amazingly responsive. We wrote a letter to the city asking for them to assist us in removing the fluorinated foam from the airport, and they were excited to help. They're writing several letters to all government entities, DOT, DHSS, to the governor, to Senator Murkowski, and several others, including Alaska Airlines, to help petition the FAA to either provide us with an exemption for the fluorinated foam or a replacement or both. And we're hoping to have our local foam replaced with the F3 that's currently being used in London at the Heathrow Airport with great success from what I have read. So we have had some positive outcomes, but it's such a long road. It's really obvious to me how this is going to be a lot of work for a long time to get any sort of reparations or remediation. There's still a lot of exposed surface water that's contaminated that floods when it rains, and we're in Southeast Alaska, so it rains a lot. So there's recontamination potential all the time, and it really seems to like to move. So I think that we have a lot of cleanup ahead of us. I'm not sure how they're going to do that, but ultimately our group and I would like to see blood tests and breast milk tests be offered to anyone who has a reasonable suspicion of exposure. So whether your well is contaminated or you volunteered at the school or you lived here 20 years ago, we would like to have anybody who's interested have the ability to know how contaminated their body is. We want the AFFF removed from the airport, and we'd like to see a reasonable effort towards reparation of damages. I don't know what can be done. We're still working on that. What is even reasonable to ask for? What can you do to reclaim a property that is so deeply contaminated? And it's my, as you introduced me, it's my family's homestead. So the plume from the airport comes across my family's land, and there's a couple of outliers, but the majority of it is right through my family. So at least I'm in good company with my my family. I've got lots of support in this. But yeah, I've been shocked at the lack of response. I've been from government entities, and I've been shocked at the outpouring of response from locals. It's been an interesting battle, I guess. I thank you for letting me talk about it.
Thank you. And that's exactly what strikes me. This is the first time I've heard your story, and I'm definitely struck by the fact that, you know, it was such an alarming problem, but also that you moved really fast. I mean, you've been doing so much, and then to inform your community and get the community on board with forming an actual group that's going to work on this, you know, if you can keep that momentum going, you know, I think you just got to keep working on it. And certainly Alaska Community Action on Toxics is there to support you. And there are other communities across the nation facing a similar situation. So there are a lot of resources out there. We plan to have our webpage for this call include all of those resources. Great. So I'd like to let everyone who's listening know that if you would like to get in touch with Kelly, especially if you're a Southeast resident, you just want to help with the cause, to please contact the Alaska Community Action on Toxics office, and they can help put you in touch.